Hey guys, Miss Ebert here. Today we're going to be reading chapters 15 and 16 of Mr. Popper's Penguins. Chapter 15, Popper's Performing Penguins. At that moment they were interrupted by the manager, who came in with a groan. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "The marvelous Marcos, who closed the program, haven't turned up, and the audience are demanding their money back." "What are you going to do?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Give it to 'em, I suppose. And here it is, Saturday night, the biggest night of the week. I hate to think of losing all that money." "I have an idea," said Mrs. Popper. "Maybe you won't have to lose it. As long as it's the end of the program, why don't we just have the Penguins rehearse right out there on the real stage? We'd have more room, and I think the audience would enjoy it." "All right," said the manager. "Let's try it." So the Penguins had their first rehearsal on a real stage. The manager stepped out on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hand, "with your kind indulgence, we are going to try out a little novelty number tonight. Owing to unforeseen circumstances, the marvelous Marcos are unable to appear. We are going to let you see a rehearsal of the Popper performing Penguins instead. I thank you." In a dignified way, the Poppers and the Penguins walked out on stage, and Mrs. Popper sat down at the piano. "Aren't you going to take off your gloves to play?" asked the manager. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Popper. "I'm so used to playing with them that I'll keep them on, if you don't mind." Then she started Schubert's Military March. The Penguins began to drill very nicely, wheeling and changing their formation with great precision, until Mrs. Popper stopped playing in the middle of the piece. The audience clapped vigorously. "There's more to it," exclaimed Mrs. Popper, half to the manager and half to the audience, "where they form a hollow square and march in that formation. It's so late, though, we'll skip that tonight and jump right to the second part." "You sure you don't want to take your gloves off, madam?" asked the manager. Mrs. Popper smilingly shook her head and began the Merry Widow Waltz. 10 of the Penguins now formed in a semicircle, as Nelson and Columbus, in their midst, put on a wild sparring contest. Their round black heads leaned far back so that the other could watch each other with both round white eyes. "Gork!" said Nelson, punching Columbus right in the stomach with his right flipper, and then trying to push him over with his left flipper. "Gaw!" said Columbus, going into a clinch and hanging his head over Nelson's shoulder as he tried to punch him in the back. "Hey, no fair!" said the manager. Columbus and Nelson broke loose as the other 10 Penguins, looking on, applauded with their flippers. Columbus now sparred politely with Nelson until Nelson hit him right in the eye, whereupon Columbus retreated with a loud "Ork!" and the other Penguins began to clap, and the audience joined them. As Mrs. Popper finished the waltz, both Nelson and Columbus stopped fighting, put down their flippers, and stood still facing each other. "Which bird won? Who's ahead?" shouted the audience. "Gook!" said all 10 Penguins in the semicircle. This must have meant look, for Nelson turned to look at them, and Columbus immediately punched him right in the stomach with one flipper, and knocked him down with the other. Nelson lay there with his eyes closed. Columbus then counted 10 over the Nelson, and again the 10 other Penguins applauded. "That's part of the act," exclaimed Janie. "The other Penguins all like Columbus to win, so they all say gook at the end. That always makes Nelson look away so Columbus can sock him good." Nelson now rose to his feet, and all the Penguins formed a row and bowed to the manager. "Thank you," said the manager, bowing back. "Now comes part 3, said Mr. Popper. "Oh, Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "you forgot to bring the 2 painting step-ladders and the board." "That's all right," said the manager. "I'll get the stagehands to bring some." And in no time at all, a pair of ladders and a board were brought in, and Mr. Popper and the children showed them how the ladders had to be set up with the board resting on top. Then Mrs. Popper began playing the pretty descriptive piece, By the Brook. At this point in the act, the Penguins always forgot their discipline and got dreadfully excited. They would all begin shoving at once to see which one could be the first one to climb the ladders. However, the children had always told Mr. Popper that the act was all funnier for all this pushing and scrambling, and Mr. Popper supposed it was. So now, with a great deal of squawking, the Penguins fought and climbed the ladders and ran across the board in complete confusion, often knocking each other entirely off onto the floor below, and then hurrying to toboggan down the other ladder and knock off any Penguins who were trying to climb up there too. This part of the act was very wild and very noisy, in spite of Mrs. Popper's delicate music. The manager and the audience were all holding their sides laughing. At last, Mrs. Popper got to the end of the music and took off her gloves. "You'll have to get those ladders off the stage, or I'll never get these birds under control," said Mr. Popper. "The curtain is supposed to fall at this point," so the manager gave the signal for the curtain to go down, and the audience stood up and cheered. When the ladders had been taken away, the manager had 12 ice cream cones brought in for the penguins. But Janie and Bill began to cry, so the manager ordered several more, and everybody had one. Mr. Greenbaum was the first to congratulate the Poppers. "I don't mind telling you, Mr. Popper, that I think you've got something absolutely unique in those birds. Your act is such a sensation, and all the way you helped out my friend the manager here shows that you're real troopers, just the kind that we need in the show business. I'd like to predict that your penguins will soon be packing the biggest theaters from Oregon to Maine. And now, to come to terms, Mr. Popper," he continued, "how about a 10-week contract at $5,000 a week?" "Is that all right, Mama?" asked Mr. Popper. "Yes, that is very satisfactory," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well then," said Mr. Greenbaum, "just sign these papers and be ready to open next Thursday in Seattle." "Thanks again," said the manager. "Would you mind putting on your gloves again for just a minute, Mrs. Popper? I'd like you to start playing that military march again and let the penguins parade for a minute. I want to get my ushers in here to take a look at those birds. It would be a good lesson to them." Chapter 16. On the Road. During the next day, there was much to be done at 432 Proudfoot Avenue. There were new clothes to buy, for all of them, and the old ones to pack away in mothballs. Then Mrs. Popper had to scrub and polish and straighten the entire house, for she was much too good a housekeeper to leave everything at 6s and 7s while the Poppers were away. Mr. Greenbaum sent them their first week's pay in advance. The first thing they did was pay off that man who had installed the freezing plant in the basement. He had been getting rather uneasy about his money. After all, without him they could have never trained the penguins. Next, they sent a check to the company who had been shipping the fresh fish all the way from the coast. At last, everything was done, and Mr. Popper turned the key in the door of the little house. They were a little late in arriving at the railway station on account of an argument with the traffic policeman. The argument was on account of an accident to two taxicabs. With 4 Poppers and 12 penguins, not to mention the 8 suitcases, and pail of water with the live fish for the penguins' lunch, Mr. Popper found that they could not all fit into one cab, so he had to call a second one. Each of the taxi drivers was eager to be the first one to get to the station, and surprise the people there by opening the door of his cab and letting out 6 penguins. So they raced each other all the way, and in the last block they tried to pass each other, and one of the fenders got torn off. The traffic officer naturally got very much annoyed by this. The train was about to pull out of the station when they arrived. Even with both taxi drivers helping them through the gate and over the brass rails into the rear observation platform, they barely made it. The penguins were gasping. It had been decided that Mr. Popper should ride in the baggage car with the penguins to keep them from getting nervous, while Mrs. Popper and the children should ride in one of the Pullmans. Because of getting on the observation end of the train, Mr. Popper had to take the birds through the entire length of the train. It was easy enough to get them through the cab car, even with the pail of fish to carry. In the sleeping cars, however, where the porter was already making up some of the berths, there was trouble. The porter's ladders offered too much temptation to the penguins. There were a dozen happy orks from a dozen ecstatic beaks. Poppers performing penguins, completely forgetting their discipline, fought to climb the ladders and get into the upper berths. Poor Mr. Popper. One old lady screamed that she was going to get off the train, whether it was going 90 miles an hour or not. And a gentleman wearing a clergyman's collar suggested opening a window so that the penguins could just jump out. 2 porters tried to shoo the birds out of the berths. Finally, the conductor and the brakeman, with a lantern, came to the rescue. It was quite a while before Mr. Popper got his pets safely in the baggage car. Mrs. Popper worried a little at the start over the idea of having Janie and Bill miss 10 weeks of school while they were on the road, though the children didn't seem to mind. "And you must remember, my love," said Mr. Popper, who had never really before been out of Stillwater, in spite of his dreams of distant countries. "Travel. is very broadening. From the start, the Penguins were a riotous success. Even their opening performance in Seattle went off without a hitch, probably because they had already rehearsed on a real stage. It was here that the Penguins added a little novelty number of their own to the program. They were the first thing on the bill. When they finished their regular act, the audience went wild. They clapped and they stamped, and they roared for more of Popper's performing penguins. Janie and Bill helped their father herd the penguins off the stage so that the next act could go on. This act was a tightrope walker named Monsieur Duval. The trouble was that instead of watching him from the wings, as they should have done, the penguins got interested and walked out on the stage and under to watch him more closely. Unfortunately, at this moment, Monsieur Duval was doing a very difficult dance on the wire overhead. The audience, of course, had thought that the Penguins were all through, and were very much pleased to see them return to the lineup with their backs to the audience, to look up at Monsieur Duval dancing so carefully on the wire high above them. This made everyone laugh so hard that Monsieur Duval lost his balance. "Ork," said the Penguins, waddling away hurriedly, in order not to be under him when he fell. Cleverly recovering his balance, Monsieur Duval caught the wire by the inside of his elbow and shoved himself up. He was very angry when he saw that Popper's performing penguins, opening wide their 12 red beaks as if they were laughing at him. "Go away, you stupid things," he said to them in French. "Ork," said the penguins, pretending not to understand, and making remarks to each other in penguin language about Monsieur Duval. And whenever they appeared, the more they interfered with the other acts on the program, the better the audience liked them. All right, that's all for today.